just wanted to tell you a little bit about the presentation. So for the effectiveness studies that are required as part of the Phase 2, Eastern Washington Phase 2 permits, they have the option of evaluating structural BMPs, either developing new structural BMPs and evaluating them following tape, or modifying existing BMPs and evaluate them following tape. And so I was asked if I could come and give an overview as to what that really entails. What's the kind of cost and the level of effort required to go through the full tape program. And so I'm going to give an overview of that and also talk a little bit about our use level documents, which are the documents that are put out when technologies are either in the program or have been approved, and kind of give guidance to the end user as to how to design and install those technologies. And then talk a little bit about whether there is any difference in terms of the technologies that can be used in Eastern Washington or Western Washington. And so first, just wanted to say, Mark kind of gave a little hint to this, but the TAPE program, it's kind of an awful acronym, but it's a Technology Assessment Protocol-Ecology, and it's Ecology's program that the Washington Stormwater Center and the University of Washington Tacoma Center for Urban Waters, my role there, help Ecology, work directly with Ecology to manage that program. But we don't do it on our own. We actually have a group called the Stakeholders Advisory Group that's made up of folks from jurisdictions within Washington State and also from the city of Portland. And Mark has been on the Stakeholders Advisory Group since the beginning, I guess. So, and they help provide guidance and input with any development or changes to the TAPE program, since they're ultimately going to be the ones approving these to be used in their jurisdictions. And then we also have a board of external reviewers, and that's made up of stormwater experts from around the country, from different academics and so forth, and they help review any documents that are submitted to the program to give us recommendations on whether or not we should approve these technologies. A little bit of a history of TAPE. It was opened, I think, back in 2002, or it's been open since 2002. It was closed briefly between 2008 and 2011 because Ecology didn't have the staffing or funding to keep it going. And so there was a hold on accepting new applicants to come through the program. And then in 2011 is when the Stormwater Center got involved. And so my predecessor at the Stormwater Center was brought on to manage the program. And so we're funded directly from Ecology to help them manage the program, and have been doing that since 2011. And the reason, little background, as I'm sure most of you know, there's the stormwater management manuals for Eastern and Western Washington, and they help provide guidance on controls that are necessary to help improve the quality and quantity of stormwater that's coming off of new and redevelopment sites. And within those documents, there are 8 core elements, or what they're called in Eastern Washington, or 9 minimum requirements that state what you need to do on these new and redevelopment sites to help protect the waters and help deal with your stormwater. And core element number 5, or minimum requirement number 6, core element is, again, the Eastern Washington minimum requirement is the Western Washington, deals with runoff treatment. And there's been talk earlier about on-site management. That's completely separate. There's also been talk about flow control. That's completely separate. So minimum requirement number 6 and core element number 5 deals just with runoff treatment. So we're not talking about low impact development. We're not talking about infiltration. Is just treatment. And I don't know if any of you were in Doug's talk yesterday, but there's a big long flow chart that you can go through to determine whether or not your site needs to have treatment. And I'm not going to go into that because it could be another half-hour discussion. But it is within the manual, and you can go through the steps in the manual to determine whether or not your site needs treatment. And also in the stormwater management manuals, there are design criteria for what we call public domain BMPs, such as sand filters or swales. And there's a presumption that if you design these public domain BMPs following the design criteria laid out in the manual, that they will meet the requirements in your permit. With proprietary devices, you can't make that same presumption. And so you actually have to, the companies of these proprietary devices have to actually demonstrate that their technologies meet the requirements of ecology and the requirements of the permit and of the stormwater management manuals. And so that is where TAPE comes along. And so TAPE are the protocols that these companies have to follow in order to get their device approved to be used in Washington State. And we've actually also had a couple of what Mark, well, one of the things, times I've worked with Mark was when he was back at WashDOT, and WashDOT has also had a few products that have gone through TAPE when they've made changes to their BMPs. And so if they want to make changes, like they had a compost amended bioswale that they put through the TAPE program to show that it was effective and that it would still meet the ecology requirements. And so after determining whether or not you need treatment on your site, you then have to determine what type of treatment you need. And there are 6 levels of treatment, although pre-treatment is really, it's required. It can't be its own standalone treatment. It needs to be, pre-treatment is some kind of device that is upstream of another BMP, usually upstream of some kind of infiltration device or upstream of a filter device, a sand filter or a proprietary filter, to help extend the life of that filter or to extend the maintenance cycle of that filter. For all other new and redevelopment projects that require treatment, basic treatment is required. So basic treatment is the bare minimum of what you need to do to treat the runoff from your site, and that is treatment for total suspended solids. Depending on the type of site, you may also be required to do enhanced, which is for dissolved copper and zinc, and those sites tend to be more high traffic commercial type sites. Or phosphorus, you might have to be required to do phosphorus treatment, and those are for sites that discharge to phosphorus sensitive water bodies. And then there also is an oil treatment category for sites that have a lot of transportation or lots of traffic or transport of oil. But if you are required to do enhanced, just want to kind of touch on this, if you're required to do enhanced, you're also required to do basic. So no matter what, you have to do basic, and then the enhanced and the phosphorus can be added on top of that. So the entire process to go through the TAPE from the very beginning to getting the approval at the end, we estimate takes about 3 years and costs about $250,000. So it's not cheap and it's not quick, but we feel that the data that comes out of there is robust, and if you follow protocols, it's robust, and we can feel confident that the technologies that have gone through and have been approved will work as they have shown us in their study. We'll continue to work on other projects or on other sites. And I'm going to break it down kind of by portion here. The first step is to actually submit an application to even get into the program. So you need to have, so anybody who wants to enter the program or do a TAPE evaluation, they need to have existing data. And so they would submit that data to myself and to the Department of Ecology. We would review that data and determine whether or not we feel confident, not guaranteed of course, but we feel confident that when they go through the full field evaluation, that they will meet the requirements and get their general use, their final approval. And so if we feel that way, then we will either give them a pilot use level designation or a conditional use level designation. And a pilot use level designation is usually what we give to companies that have only laboratory data. So if they're doing their column studies or doing other kinds of studies in the lab using synthetic stormwater, we will limit them to a pilot use level designation. And with that, they are allowed to install up to 5 of their technologies in Washington State, but they have to monitor each and every one that they install. And so it's kind of a high bar in terms of, or not, I mean, it's a lower bar for entry, but they're not granted as many, as much leniency in how many units they can, how many systems they can install, and they are required to do more monitoring once they are installed to move through the TAPE program. If somebody comes to us with field data, and the field data doesn't have to be collected in Washington State, it can be collected from anywhere around the country. If they come to us with field data, and we feel confident in the fact that their system will work, we grant them a conditional use level designation. They can then install up to 10 of their systems in Washington State, and they only need to monitor 1 of those. And currently there are about 17 technologies that have either a pilot use or a conditional use level designation. Once they're granted their use level designation, it goes up on the ecology website. And so really want to point this out because this is a really good resource to go to if for design engineers or for regulatory agencies or jurisdictions that are going to be installing these. You want to make sure that you refer to the use level designation to make sure that these are being installed and sized according to the use level designation and according to ecology's requirements. And so there's a link up at the top there, but this is the page, ecology's page, that kind of lists out the different technologies and which type of use level designation they have. And if you click on the device name, it'll bring up their individual use level designation document. And so here is one for a device called the Kraken, which I think they're out in the hallway there. But so they have a pilot use level designation for basic. And obviously they then submitted us lab data. Based on their lab data, we felt confident that they would be able to be likely to make it through the program and get approval. And so then they are granted this, and then the use level designation here designates their design flow rate, which is then used to size the system. And so right now, the Kraken is allowed to install 5 of these in the state. Right now they only have 1, and they are testing that 1. But so this use level designation will show you, I'll get into more parts of it later, but this initial part shows you just the design flow rate that these systems are designed to treat, and then that design flow rate is what is used to size these when you actually install them in the field. So once they get their PULD or their CULD, they then need to find a potential site. This is a place where a lot of folks get hung up because there are some tricky parts of finding a perfect site. It needs to be, right now, they say it needs to be in the Pacific Northwest. So it needs to be either in Washington State, we do have some folks that are doing testing down in Oregon, but it needs to be in the Pacific Northwest. Not only that, the pollutant concentrations need to be in a certain range that we have, that ecology has determined is indicative of highway runoff or stormwater runoff from highways and residential areas and areas where these systems will be installed. And this is a list of the pollutant concentration ranges. If you're collecting data and they don't fall in this range, according to TAPE right now, and I'll talk a little bit about this because we're making some changes to it, but they cannot use that data. So you collect your samples, you submit it to the lab, you get the sample results back, and it doesn't fall into this range, and you throw that out and have to try again. So it's really important for folks in finding a site to do a lot of site characterization studies, collect data up front to make sure that they feel confident that most of their samples will fall within that range. And then another item that makes it difficult sometimes in finding a site is the technology requirements. They're having to go in and oftentimes retrofit an area to install their technology in the field. Sorry, that's one thing that I forgot to mention is to go through the TAPE approval, it needs to be a field evaluation. And so it needs to be in a field evaluation in the Pacific Northwest. And so they need to find a site that they can retrofit to install their technology. And so depending on the hydraulic requirements of the device, depending on whether the jurisdiction wants to have monitoring going on at that site, they might not want to know what kind of pollutants are coming off at that site and have that data submitted to ecology. And so it can be very tricky to find an appropriate site. And one thing we're working on with TAPE right now is to actually hopefully make that a little bit easier. We have a couple of sites that we have designated as, or that we're looking to designate as stormwater technology evaluation facilities. And this is where we're actually looking to start accepting testing outside of Washington State, not at just any old facility or any old site, but actually have approved sites where we've worked with the folks ahead of time, gotten data from them to determine that we feel that sites, that evaluations that are done at their facility, we feel confident that those technologies will work in Washington State. And so right now we have the Lake Union Ship Canal Test Facility is the one that Mark was talking about. I've spent a few years under that site developing or evaluating a couple of technologies, a storm filter and an aqua filter that were installed there for the city of Tacoma. And that site's back up and running with, it has ability to test 4 different technologies at once. It's kind of a plug and play type of site where you have water coming out of 4 pipes out of the side of the hill, with runoff from the I-5 Ship Canal Bridge. The ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation, has a stormwater technology testing center, which is down just outside of Portland. And they developed that site more as a maintainability center, ability to test the maintenance requirements of these devices using pumped stormwater, and so they can really stress these systems and send water through it quickly. But they're also looking at doing it as a tape testing facility, and they actually have been approved. It's not up and running yet, but they have been approved to do tape testing there. And then we're also working with the University of New Hampshire Stormwater Center and the Oregon State University Green Stormwater Infrastructure Research Facility. We haven't received data packages from them yet, so they are not online yet as being tape-approved facilities, but we are working with them to get data for them, and then we'll review that along with folks from our stakeholders advisory group and determine whether or not we feel that those would be appropriate sites. We'd also love, potentially to have testing out here in Eastern Washington. As far as I know, there's never been a tape evaluation in Eastern Washington. And I'm not quite sure why. I don't know if the rain is too sparse and it would be harder to get the samples. But we're always looking for new facilities of this type to start a potential partnership with them to make it easier for the manufacturers or the vendors or anybody going through this program to find a site that would be suitable for tape testing. So once they find their site, they actually have to prepare a quality assurance project plan that is sent off to our Board of External Reviewers for their review, and I review it in conjunction with them. Once it's approved, then it moves on to the field evaluation. And this takes about 1.5 to 2 years. We'd like to see the systems evaluated over 1.5 maintenance cycles or 2 wet seasons. So if you have a treatment system that has a maintenance cycle that's longer than a year, then we do say, or longer than 2 years, we do say you can just evaluate it over 2 wet seasons. But you also need to collect samples from 12 qualifying storm events in that time period, a minimum of 12 qualifying storm events. And those samples have to meet certain sampling requirements. And so they have to be flow-weighted composite sampling. They have to meet the storm event and sampling criteria, which is a certain storm size, a certain antecedent dry period, a certain storm event coverage, and then again has to meet the influent concentration range. And so they're out there collecting paired sampling, paired influent and effluent sampling, and if you get the results back and they don't meet your influent range, those results are tossed and you need to keep sampling. And so there's a minimum of 12 qualifying storm events, and then above and beyond that to meet the performance goals listed in tape. And I neglected to put that on here, but the performance goals for basic, they have to show that they can remove more than 80% of total suspended solids. For dissolved zinc, they have to remove more than 60%, dissolved copper more than 30%, and total phosphorus more than 50%. And so if they can go through and collect all their data and tell us with 95, show us that the upper 95% confidence interval around the mean effluent concentration or the lower 95% confidence interval around the mean removal efficiency meets that requirement, then they meet the ecology goals, and that they can be approved to be used in Washington State. But there is some additional data they have to collect. They have to collect continuous flow data, influent, effluent, and bypass flow, and they have to maintain operation and maintenance records and submit operation and maintenance records. And these are basically so that we don't take a close look at the maintenance data and make determined suggestions on maintenance requirements, but we do like to see, we don't want to have somebody out there maintaining their system every storm event and saying, look how good it works. So that's what we do with the continuous flow data. The bypass data can tell us whether it went into bypass at flow rates lower than the design flow level, then maybe we know that it's not working as well as they say it's working, or it's bypassing too much flow. And the operations and maintenance records can let us know whether they're maintaining the system more frequently. We don't know, it doesn't necessarily mean that it would be up to the Board of External Reviewers to also give recommendation on this. If they have frequent maintenance, they may be denied approval. If they are approved, it's likely going to be in their ULD document that we recommend that this is maintained at this frequency, or just stating that this is how much maintenance the unit that was tested needed. So once they finish their field evaluation, is that still on? Okay. Once they complete their field evaluation, they can move on to prepare a technology evaluation report, submitting all of their data, all of their flow data, all their water quality data, all their maintenance records, all of their statistical analysis, and that, again, is sent back out to our Board of External Reviewers for their review, and then make recommendations to ecology as to whether or not they should receive the ultimate approval, which is considered the general use level designation. And the general use level designation, there is no expiration. Forgot to mention earlier with the pilot use level designation and the conditional, they do have expiration dates. They have dates. We want to see these companies actively moving through the program. We don't want them to just get a conditional use level designation, sell 10 units in Washington State, and then say that, that was their only intent. We want to see them actively moving through the program. And so we give them dates by which they need to submit a quality assurance project plan, dates by which they need to submit a final report, and then an expiration date on their conditional or pilot use level designation. Those expiration dates can be extended if they're having trouble finding a site, if they're having to continue their monitoring because they're not getting the influent requirements. We do extend that expiration date as long as we feel that they are still actively moving through the program. And there's also, with a general use level designation, there's no limits on the number of installations. So once you have that approval, you are approved to be used to install as many units in Washington State as the jurisdictions will, or the design engineers will allow. And there are, I think there's 17 systems right now with the current general use level designation. This is kind of just the breakdown of where they fall. As you can see, most, the biggest is the basic treatment. Most of them only go for basic treatment. We do have some that also have phosphorus and enhanced, a few just pre-treatment, and a couple that, that do also have the oil treatment designation. Just want to repeat again that you have to go for, if you're going for enhanced and phosphorus, you also have to go for basic. So any of these that have enhanced or phosphorus also have that basic designation. And then we update the use level designation to demonstrate that they have made it through the program. I did want to call out that, so this is an example of a technology that has a general use level designation for basic and phosphorus, but it still only has a conditional for enhanced. And so they're continuing to do testing for their dissolved metals removal, but they do have the approval for TSS and phosphorus. And so this is an instance where so they are still limited to only installing 10 of these on sites that require enhanced treatment. If a site requires basic or phosphorus, they can install as many as they can bid out. But if the site requires enhanced treatment, they're only allowed to install 10 of these. This is not something that we expect the jurisdictions to stay on top of, and it's something that ecology is starting to track. But it really is more up to the vendor. We're kind of relying on the vendors, to be honest, about how many they have installed. And ecology has started asking them to submit documents listing how many they have installed, where those installations are. And one thing to note also is we only count the installations that are installed for new and redevelopment projects. So if it was installed because of retrofit, because a city decided they wanted to, install say a Filterra into a parking lot, not because they had to, they just wanted to retrofit the site and do it, that doesn't count against one of their installations. Or if it was installed on an industrial site for treatment of an industrial facility that for their industrial stormwater permit, they don't need to worry about they don't need to count that against their number that they are only allowed to install. It's just when it's installed for new and redevelopment projects. A few other things that are listed in the GOLD. This is the one instance, this is the only time that there really is a difference in terms of Western and Eastern Washington. And it's based on how they size their systems. And so there's different sizing within the Eastern Washington Manual and the Western Washington Manual, and this is listed in the use level documents to refer folks from those jurisdictions to go into their stormwater management manual and use that sizing calculation and the Western Washington Hydrology Manual to figure out what size system, based on the design flow rate, what size system they need to meet their requirements. And then there's also a whole list of, that's probably too small for you guys to see, but there's a whole list of conditions of use. And these are really important to pay attention to. This is, where we kind of list out if there were issues with the maintenance, whether they had, if they had to maintain it more frequently than we would have liked to see or that they generally like to see, it would list it out here. It also lists here in terms of what the owner of the BMP needs to do for maintenance, and within the first year, what ecology requires is that there's actually a maintenance inspection done monthly during the wet season, and I think every 2 months during the during the dry season, and then they use information from that first year to come up with their maintenance plan for the following years. And so we do want to encourage any person who's going to be installing these or designing these into their project to really take a good look at these use level documents, because it provides some necessary information to make sure that these are designed and installed correctly. There's also other parts of the general use level designation. There's a document, there's the application documents. It lists all of the application documents that the company used or submitted to ecology and to the TAPE program when they were going through the program. It lists their performance claims and findings of fact. And so if you want to just quickly go and scroll down and see, well, how many storms were evaluated and what exactly did they find? We know that it's approved to remove 80% TSS, but what exactly did the evaluation find? That would be listed in the findings of fact. And then there is a section that lists the potential issues to be addressed by the manufacturer, and this is not necessarily something that they have to do, or not necessarily an indication that there were issues, but it's just something that ecology thinks could be beneficial additional information to find out. And so for that, examples of that are like if they wanted to have more maintenance and inspection data collected to figure out how often these need to be maintained, if they wanted to have additional studies done to determine the maximum treatment life expectancy of the system and so forth. Ecology will just put those recommendations in there, but they're not binding. The manufacturer doesn't have to follow that necessarily. And one other thing to note also is that, let's say a company gets a CULD, somebody installs that in their jurisdiction, and that company doesn't follow through, they decide, you know what, we can't find a site, it's too expensive, we're not going to go through with the TAPE evaluation, we would like to pull our application. That unit that was installed under the CULD can remain in place. Ecology is not going to require that those are removed. And so the jurisdiction doesn't need to be worried about if that's installed and it doesn't eventually get their GULD for one reason or another. Ecology will not require that is removed. That can remain in place. And then just a few other TAPE program updates. So I mentioned the TAPE Stormwater Technology Evaluation Facilities, and so that's our effort to kind of look outside of Washington State, look at some kind of designated some form of facilities as TAPE testing sites. As I said, we have two that we're working with right now, two more that are hopefully going to be submitting data soon, and we're always looking for other partners. And so if people out there have suggestions of universities or other areas where they're doing these, have the ability to do these type of evaluations, we would love to be connected with them. There's also an effort to do a national testing protocol, and this is something that's being pushed by the Water Environment Federation. It's called the Stormwater Testing and Evaluation of Products and Practices. And the $250,000 gets you approved in Washington State. Now there are other jurisdictions and other states that allow TAPE approval, that follow TAPE approval, but there are many that don't. And so it's a kind of a barrier to entry to innovation, that a lot of these companies aren't able to do multiple evaluations, and especially if it only gets them very limited, gets entry into our own limited markets. And so there's a push to get this national evaluation, this national testing program. And the thought is right now that it would have likely both a field evaluation component and a laboratory evaluation component. The field evaluation component would likely be based on TAPE, on the Washington State TAPE protocol. The lab component would likely be based on a program that's in New Jersey. It's called the NJCAT protocol. Washington State will still always require field protocol. So if they move forward with this national protocol, states could determine whether or not they're okay with only field testing, or whether they require, if they're okay with lab testing, or if they require field testing. And as I understand it, ecology is not going to take a step backwards. So they're always going to need something that is equivalent to TAPE. And so they will still, even if the national program, if companies go through the national program, they would still require any systems within Washington State to be to have gone through the field program of that. And then we're making some updates to the guidance document. I mentioned the influent requirements, that right now that if your samples don't fall within that influent range, they have to be tossed, they can't be used. We're actually starting to allow people, if they have samples that have higher concentrations than the influent requirements, we're allowing them to use those as long as when they do their statistical analysis, they cap that value at the upper end of the range. And so if the copper range, dissolved copper range is 0.005 to 0.02 milligrams per liter. If they had a 0.03 milligram per liter result for an influent, they could use that, but they're capped at 0.02 when they're doing their statistical analysis and their performance evaluation. We're also looking at adding some additional parameters. There are 3 times in the evaluation where they have to collect screening parameters that are outside of the TSS, dissolved metals, and phosphorus. And like they have to collect particle size distribution samples. And so we're thinking about adding on fecal coliform and nitrogen to that, to add those for screening parameters. And then we're finalizing what's called the long detention random sampling protocol, and this is something that's been in draft form since 2008. And WashDOT actually did an evaluation following that protocol, and it was successful. And so right now the TAPE program really only is applicable for short detention devices that are able to collect paired influent and effluent samples. So we're hoping to finalize this summer, it's been a long time coming, but to finalize this summer this long detention, this protocol for evaluating long detention BMPs, where you don't actually collect paired sampling, you collect samples randomly from the influent and randomly from the effluent, and don't look at them as pairs. And I think that's it.